Good afternoon. My name is Ann Billisbach, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. These programs are held every third Thursday of the month here in room 303 on the third floor of the City County building. A detailed schedule for this lecture series you can find on our website at nebraskahistory.org, and there you'll also find information about all of the other programs and activities of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. They fund the filming of these lectures, and their financial support allows us to tape them and then to make them available on public access television, Channel 5 here in Lincoln, and on the Nebraska State Historical Society's YouTube channel. So you have a couple of different opportunities to see this program if you can't make it to see it today. Our speaker today is Kelli Bacon, Nebraska State Historical Society Historical Preservation Archivist. Kelli is a native of Minnesota, and she's been with the Historical Society for about 8 years. Her talk today will be on county poor farms, once a familiar feature across the Nebraska countryside. So join me in welcoming Kelli.
Thank you, Ann. And just to let you know, I'm going to get through as many slides as I can today. I have a lot of information, but if you have questions about anything afterwards, I would be more than happy to answer them. And today's lecture, I'm going to concentrate more on the farmsteads themselves and talk about that history. There's a plethora of information that I've been able to find. It just isn't all going to fit into a 45-minute presentation, so I will start with that. And several people have asked me, so what is a poor farm? And counties started poor farms to care for their poor, needy, elderly, sick, those people. And they were people that either didn't have anywhere else to go, maybe couldn't live on their own anymore, or didn't have any family in the area, or didn't have family who was willing to take care of them. And the counties hoped that these farms would be kind of a self-supporting institution. There would be a manager, a caretaker, and his family who lived at this farm and ran it as a farm with crops, livestock, sometimes gardens or orchards, that they could sell the products of this farm to raise enough money to cover the expenses for the year. This, most of the time, did not happen, and the county ended up putting money towards the poor farm every year, even just for things like general upkeep of the buildings, or maybe purchasing more livestock for the farm, or chickens, or that sort of thing. And then the manager's wife typically did a lot of the household chores, cooking, mending, cleaning. And again, the thought was the poor people who lived at these farms would help with the managing and the functioning of this farm. They were under no obligation to help at the farm, so a lot of times they would get some minimal help, but again, it wasn't enough to really function, help a fully functioning farm. Especially, most of them were a quarter section of land, so 160 acres, but some of them were a half section of land, and for one person basically to run a farm for a year, that was quite difficult. And from what I've been able to find out so far, approximately 60 counties in Nebraska had a poor farm. And Cheyenne and Perkins had poor farms, but didn't have any buildings on them. So they just had the farmland with crops, but there were no livestock or any other buildings. And that is probably because there just weren't enough people to warrant building a structure. So they maybe had a couple of people in the county who were willing to rent a room to some of these people. The first one, from what I've been able to discover, started in 1859, and that was in Douglas County. And the last poor farm that the land was sold to a private individual was 1962, and that was Saunders County. But the start of Social Security sort of ended a lot of the functioning poor farms. A lot of times the counties kept the land, but maybe rented it to a farmer before they eventually just sold off the land completely. And here are some locations of poor farms. And to give you, there's kind of some color coding there. The purple little kind of balloons there are farms where there's a house that is still standing. The black balloons are farms where there are no buildings remaining. I know they were located in that location at one point, but the house is gone and so are the outbuildings. The orange ones show farms where the house isn't there anymore, but there are some outbuildings of some sort. And the purple ones are dedicated to specific cemeteries. Some counties, their poor farms had a dedicated cemetery and not just a section in one of the local cemeteries. And I'm going to go through these now, some of them county by county, but I picked the ones where I at least had a decent picture of the house, since I've been talking more about the farmsteads today. So. And here's just some examples that kind of breaking down where the extant poor farms are shown, non-extant, and then the cemeteries. And you can tell, you can see there weren't a lot in kind of the north central part and the sandhills of Nebraska, but again, populations were lower then, so there just maybe wasn't as great of a need. And there are a few counties I just haven't been able to find where the poor farm is located. I maybe know there was a farm in the county, I just don't know where yet. So to start off with Adams County, and this is the house, and in the top right, a photo of kind of the whole farmstead. This one was 320 acres, so half a section of land, which was quite large for Nebraska's poor farms. It began in 1873, and it shows a 1.5 story frame house. I would say it's more of a 2-story frame house. And Ira G. Dillon built the east portion of the house in the fall of 1872, so right before it opened up. And the west wing, which on the top left photo is the portion on the left, that was added in 1886. And the house pretty much after that addition stayed the way it was until it was destroyed about 1960s. And the poor residents lived on the second floor of the east portion of the house, so on the top left photo, the right portion. And the main floor of that section had a kitchen and a dining room, and then there were sitting rooms on the north side. In 1925, the county began renting the farm instead of using it for a county poor farm operation, which was, like I said, fairly common. And then after that, the house was damaged by fire. The county sold it then finally in 1952, and they made plans for a nursing home instead of using a farm, which this is very common across the state also. And that top photo there was taken in the 1920s sometime, and the top right photo that just shows an overview of the farm was taken in 1953, and the bottom photo was taken in 1952. So you can see some changes from the top left photo to the photo on the bottom, but there aren't a lot. For the most part, it did remain pretty much the same. And Antelope County is next, and it is 160 acres. The county purchased the land in 1887, but really started the farm in the late 1920s. They had used the land just as farmland before then. And in 1931, this house was moved to the farm, and there were also 4 small cabins that were moved there. But in the 1940s, the farm was really no longer used as a poor farm. So this one really wasn't a functioning poor farm for very long. And then in 1951, the county sold it. And that top left photo was taken in 1990, and that's from our survey photos in our office. And the top right and the bottom photos were taken about 2013. And you can still, there have been some changes and some updates to the house in that time, but it looks like it did in 1990. Unfortunately, I don't have any earlier photos of this house, so I mean, I'm always looking for more information about these farms, so it would be nice to get a little bit earlier photo of that. Next is Cass County. The county bought this house in 1871, and it started with 120 acres, but increased to it started with 80 acres, but increased to 120, which is a little bit smaller, but still a decent size. And I apologize, some of these photos are going to be a little blurry, just they're, photocopies from photocopies or just old photos, so the quality isn't always the greatest. The house was built in 1873 by Alfred Johnson and Sons and I.J. Hansen. And it shows a 2-story brick house with 3 chimneys and a large front porch, and it's a 2-story porch. And Martin Probst quarried the rock used for this house. And in 1876, I thought this was interesting, the wind was so strong that it blew off the roof of the house. So it had to be repaired and replaced. And in 1913, the house did burn down entirely, and only the brick exterior walls were remaining. But then H.B. Heading built a second house, and that stood until the 1960s. But in 1946, its function changed from being more of a poor farm to more of a nursing home. So it became known as the Hillcrest Nursing Home. And this, this house had 14 rooms with just a typical, I think, house layout, but it did have its own heating plant, and that was kept in a separate building. Here's Clay County, and again, I apologize for the blurriness of the picture. This started with 160 acres in 1874, but increased to 320 acres by 1921. I'm not exactly sure when the county bought the extra land, but they did by 1921. W.D. Young built the house in 1880, and it's a 2-story frame building with a 2-story wing in the rear. You can just see a little bit of the wing right there. And there were 2 porches that were added later on, and you can see one of them right there in the photo. And this one was used through the 1930s. And in the 1960s, 1970s, many of the buildings were torn down at this time. It wasn't a functioning poor farm anymore, and I'm sure the buildings were not in the greatest condition, but the last building was torn down in 1978. Here's Custer County. This farm began in 1888 with 400 acres, and as far as I know, I think this is the biggest farm that I know of. There are a couple that are 320 acres, but this might be the biggest. And this, because of the size of the farm, it typically meant the number of people that were here. And this was a large house. It was a 22-room frame house with the addition of a kitchen, and it was built by the Barnes brothers. I don't know their first names, I just know their last name was Barnes. But in 1909, the county started renting out part of the land. They still owned it. But this house, it burned in 1911. So a new, larger 24-room house was built in 1913. And in 1936, there was a 1-story addition put on that house by C.G. Empfield, and that enlarged the living room and added a couple of bedrooms. So there was definitely a need for a poor farm in Custer County. But then the county sold it in 1960 due to not needing the farm and nursing homes coming into prominence. And this house had its own electrical plant dedicated to the farm. Dawes County, this one started in 1893 with 160 acres. The original house I'm thinking it's not there. I don't think this is the house, but again, it could be it's in the right location. But if it is the house, it has had some modifications. But that's something I need to look into. Or if anybody has any information about this, I would be happy to get it. The original house, if this is it or not, did have 2 sections. One specifically for the manager's family and one for the poor residents. Very typical, and sometimes it was maybe the manager lived on the 1st floor, the poor people lived on the 2nd floor, or vice versa, or they divided the house into different sections. And in the original house, the poor people's area didn't have any plumbing, electricity, or any sort of central heating. Again, the county was sort of bare bones, minimal thing. So they might have a small stove in a living room that they would use for heating in the winter, but that might have been it. But the managers and his family didn't have any water or electricity, but they did have a stove for heating. And here's Fillmore County. The county purchased the farm in 1872 with 160 acres, but rented the land for a while. And the original house was built by W.H. Chapin in 1875. But then they really started the farm as a poor farm in 1878. The original house burned down in 1890, and the county decided to replace the house. The 1891 house, which it's kind of this portion of this building here, there have been a lot of modifications to this. And I'll explain that in just a second. It's 1.5 stories and had wood siding originally. In 1937, the county kind of ceased functions as a poor farm, but it became the county assistance home. Instead of a farm, it was just kind of a small part of it, and that operated for 8 years. And then sometime during those years, there was a 1-story brick structure that was built there, and it really developed into a traditional nursing home. But the land was sold in 1949. This is Furnace County, and the house is sort of in the center here with an outbuilding there. And it was called the Beaver City Poor Farm because it was near Beaver City. A lot of the poor farms were, called like the Furnace County Poor Farm, but in Furnace County, it was named after the city it was near. And this was 160 acres, so a quarter section, and of the 2-story house, and it had a front porch on both levels. And you can just make out the front porch and the 2 levels there in the photo. And it had a 2-story L on the rear, which you can see, and a hipped roof. And it looks like, there was a windmill there, maybe a couple of other outbuildings, but this is the only photo I have from that. And here is Gage County, and the house is in the top right of that photo. This one started in 1869 with 160 acres. It's a 2-story frame house with somewhere between 16 and 19 rooms. I've seen a couple of different references to the number of rooms, and I suppose it depends on how you split up a room. And there's also a 1-story cottage, which is this building right there. This photo was taken in 1937, with the house on the right and the cottage in the middle, and kind of the outbuildings on the left and kind of bottom of the photo there. Mannon and Vogt, again, I don't know their first names, but they built the cottage in 1897. And then G.W. Hazelton remodeled the house in 1909, but I don't know the extent of the remodeling. And it was again remodeled in 1916, but this time by the Randall brothers and Don McCollery. The porch moved from the front to the north side of the house, and new 2-story porches were built to extend the entire length of the north side and almost across the east side of the house. So there, I do know a little bit of the modifications to the house there. And then the lower portion of those porches were used for sun porches, and the upper portion were used as a traditional sleeping porch. And then after that, it was remodeled a couple of more times, but again, unfortunately, I don't know what the extent of those changes were. The farm closed in 1937, and the county rented the land for 10 years until they decided to sell it in 1947. But sometime after it closed in 1937, the house and the cottage were torn down, so they don't remain anymore. Here's Hall County. This top picture is from the late 1800s, and the bottom picture is from 2011. And they're taken from opposite sides of the house, but you can still tell that the form is the same. And there have been some modifications to the house with changes with windows and some doors, that sort of thing. But The form is still there. The county purchased the land in 1879, and it had 160 acres. And the farm included the 1.5-story house seen here and some outbuildings. The county thought about building a new house to replace this one, but voters in the county voted down the proposition in both 1880 and 1881. To add more room to the house, Charles Gunther added on in 1883. So it wasn't a new house, but they did get some more space to it. This county poor farm closed somewhere in 1818, 1819. And the reference that I saw said that the state legislature ordered all county institutions to be built from brick instead of being a wood frame structure with wood siding and have indoor plumbing and electricity. Hall County couldn't afford it, so they decided to close. I have yet to find the legislature in reference. It's something I have yet to do, because I haven't heard of any county other than Hall County closing because of this specific statute. So. Here's Hamilton County. And this started as 160 acres but grew to 240 acres. The house was part of Orville City, a now ghost town, when it was the county seat. This house was there. And after it lost its being the county seat, there were 4 remaining buildings. And that became the poor farm in 1884. And this photo was taken about 1888. The house is a 2-story with a pyramidal clipped peak roof, which means that there's sort of a flat top there. The pyramid doesn't continue all the way to the peak, with wood clapboard siding and 2/2 windows that you can see quite well. There you can see the top part of the 2 windows there, and there's bottom 2 there. So just kind of 2 different window pieces. And it is a symmetrical house. There are 2 windows on each side of the front door, and on the first floor there's 3 windows and 3 windows. So it's kind of a very regular plan to this house. Some of them have had additions or wings or that sort of thing. This is just a very square 2-story house. But in 1898, they did make an addition to the house, so it lost some of its just very square plan and form. And it did have, kitchen, dining room in the manager's part, and the poor lived upstairs. There were 19 bedrooms once the addition was made, which means it was a large house. They had 2 sitting rooms, but 1 specifically for men and 1 specifically for women. 3 dining rooms and 2 storerooms. So it was quite a large house. Here's Johnson County, and this is the top left photo is the one at the introduction to my talk. The first poor farm had 320 acres. There were 6 rooms downstairs and 3 rooms upstairs. In 1926, the original poor farm closed, and a second one was purchased on the west edge of Tecumseh, and this is that house there. It was built by Keim Construction in 1930. And this is great, because this house, I was able to visit and get on the land. Here's a cornerstone, and then right above the front door on the 2nd story is a sign that says Johnson County Home on it. So it's set back from the house far enough that you don't see the Johnson County Home on the house, but when you're standing right in front of it, it is definitely clear. The changes that have been made to this house, it did originally have a flat roof, but there's been kind of a gable addition to the house that you can see the kind of the peak. And this closed in 1953. Here's the Lancaster County Poor Farm, which I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with this building or have driven by it before and maybe didn't even know this was the Lancaster County Poor Farm. The county bought the land in 1872 with 240 acres. The original 2-story house that you can see, there have been some modifications to it. This current house was built in 1916 to 1917, somewhere in there. It was a 2.5-story I-plan house and was a frame house with a hipped tile roof and 1/1 and 10/1 windows, which means 1 large window over a second one, or 10 small windows over one kind of larger window piece. And fixed frame windows, or the non-movable type. There is a 2-story front porch and a balcony with square support columns and a hipped dormer, which you can see here, the dormer right there and there in that photo. It was later known as the Westview County Home or the Westview Nursing Home, and it still maintains that Westview name today. And it's designated as a Lincoln landmark, and if I am correct, it is a bed and breakfast today that you can, stay in this house. But there have been modifications, like I said, but it still has, and the outbuildings for the farm are still there also. And the change to the nursing home in this county happened in 1952 in August, but the county sold the poor farm in December of that year, so it wasn't a nursing home for long. Here's the Logan County poor farm. This does not look like a traditional poor farm necessarily, because it's the former Gandy courthouse. Gandy is no longer a town, but I found references that after everybody left in Gandy, this house was remaining, and they used that to house the poor people in town. And that is really all I know. Yes, you have a question?
Well, Lincoln County, you evidently don't have anything for Lincoln County.
I don't have a photo for it. Today I'm kind of concentrating on more of the visual parts, yes. Yep, I do have information on the Lincoln County poor farm, though. Just no photo to show you today.
Well, one of the things, if maybe Nellie Snyder Yost wrote a story
Yes,
about
yep.
the poor farm.
Yep, I am familiar with that book. I've looked at it. I haven't read it cover to cover, but I have glanced through it. Yep.
It's a sorry story.
Yep, yes, it is. Yeah, he was talking about a sad story at the Lincoln County poor farm. And if anybody has questions about that, I can answer those later. Here's the Madison County poor farm. Again, another large home. The farm was bought in 1892 and it had 160 acres. The 2-story house was built in 1893 by John Herman, and it was sold in 1959. And it had 4 bathrooms in it, large, tall ceilings, big windows, dining rooms, multiple porches. The kitchen was in the basement, which I think was interesting. There are a couple of counties where the kitchen would be in the basement, and they would maybe use a pulley system to get the food from the basement to the dining room on the first floor. Next is Nuckolls County. This farm started in 1878 with 160 acres. It's not the best picture since there's a couple of trees in front of it, but you can still sort of make out what the house looked like. It was a brick house. It was built in 1920, and the county sold it in 1948. And then the later owners tore down all of the buildings in 1988. And you can see, gable roof, front porch here, and a porch on the side over there. Here's Platte County. Again, this has had a lot of changes over the years. The county bought the land in 1896 and had 240 acres. There were 2 houses on this farm, one for the poor people and one for the manager and his family. And there was potentially a 3rd house that was used for what they called insane people. Whether or not they actually were insane is debatable, but that's what records say. And I know James Pearsall built one of the houses on this farm. I'm just not sure which one. But in 1897, Hugh Hughes built the other one. So I know the 2 builders. I just don't know who built what house. And this picture was taken in 2007. And this could be a later house. Again, a lot of the references that I find aren't necessarily complete ones, or they're a little vague. But the farm was then sold in 1954, but this is the land that the farm was at. Here's the Red Willow County poor farm. This one was 40 acres, so quite small, but I think it had a fairly impressive house to it, even though it was only kind of 1.5 stories. It was built in 1915 and is 1.5-story frame house, so again, just wood with wood clapboard siding, a full front porch with a hipped roof, 2 interior chimneys, and you can see one of them in the photos. The other one is hidden or gone by that time. The county initially decided to operate a poor farm not to exceed 160 acres in 1895, but then by 1905 there was no record of one existing, but they had built this in 1915. So it may have taken the county a little while once they established the farm to build a house for people to live. The top left picture was taken about 1918, so just a few years after the house was built. And the top right and the middle pictures were taken in 2001, and then the bottom right picture was taken in 2011. You can still see the form of the idea of the house between the top left and the bottom right photos, but there have obviously been some definite changes. Here's the Saline County poor farm. It started in 1875 with 160 acres, but grew to 320. There was a house that was built around 1885. It was a small 2-story house and then later enlarged. That house is no longer standing. The top photo here, the long photo with the farmstead, the house is way on the left, right here, some different outbuildings, and the barn. And the form of the barn and the roof lines does match the roof line of the house. This was the second house at the poor farm. It was built in 1905, and this house, again, is no longer there. This was torn down in 1937. This third house, which is these 2 photos and this kind of close-up right there, was built in 1937 by the Works Progress Administration, using some of the materials from the second house, so the photo at the top. The middle photo was taken in 1983, and I took the bottom photos there in 2013. The front porch has been removed from the house and is now sitting in front, but you can still see there are no windows anymore, but you can see it was a large house. And the left photo shows the north and west sides of the house, and then the right photo shows the north and the east sides of the house. It's 1.5 stories with what's called a jerkin head roof, and that's kind of these little clipped corners there. And had finials at the ends of it. They're a little hard to see, but there's some tiny little projections here where they would have had these finials that have pretty much broken off now, but you can still see they were there. My colleagues are working on surveying architecture in the county, so I'm hoping to get an updated picture this year to see if there have been any more changes and really kind of what's left. You can tell it's an abandoned house, so it's probably just going to be time before it's no longer there. Here's the Sarpy County house. And this is a house that I had driven by many times before I knew it was the Sarpy County Poor Farm. It was 160 acres, started in the mid-1870s. A 2-story house with wood clapboard siding and 4/4 windows that you can make out in the top photo a little bit, and a pyramidal roof, just a barely clipped kind of peak at the top with wood shingles. It had a full-length front porch that you can see and 13 to 14 rooms. In 1946, the commissioners decided to remodel the home. It had new kitchen cabinets and a furnace and running water system then. And they changed the name from the County Poor Farm to the Grandview Nursing Home. Whether or not it was really a traditional nursing home or not, I don't know. But in 1961, the last poor person moved out of the home. The county sold the house and the land in 1967 to help finance the new county courthouse. The top photo is from 2007, and I took these bottom 2 photos from the road in 2013. And in those 6 years, you can see the current owner has removed the windows and is starting to remove the siding. I don't know what the plans are for the house if they are planning on doing any remodeling, or if they're just kind of taking apart the house. Here is the Seward County Poor Farm. It started with 160 acres in 1874. The two-story house was built in 1887, and it currently has a slate roof and shingle siding to it. There have been some modifications to the house, and it had 24 rooms. This is the Sherman County Poor Farm. It was 320 acres. So this was a farm that had a lot of land to it, but not a very large house. The county purchased the land in 1878, but didn't build any of the buildings until 1884. And then by 1914, the county decided to just rent the land. And this house has, again, a pyramidal clipped peak roof with but there's a gable L addition, the gable sort of addition with the peaked roof on the left side of the photo. And there have been some modifications with windows and other, the roofing material is different. But this is the Washington County Poor Farm. It started with 80 acres, and I don't have a photo, but I do have this drawing that will give you an idea. It started in 1877 and is a two-story frame house. In 1930, fire destroyed most of the house and it wasn't replaced. The county sold the farm in 1938. And I was very happy when a couple of my colleagues at the Historical Society were recently, this is just, it's in the city limits of Blair now. It wasn't at the time it was functioning. I knew approximately where the farm was, but a couple of my colleagues were able to determine where it was by some silos that are still there. That's all that remains of the Poor Farm now. Here is the Wayne County Poor Farm. That's all I could find, the photo. The top left, it is not a very good photo. It was a small, very small photo in a book that I found, and the photo in the book was not very good to begin with. But again, this, like in Gandy, this was an old courthouse. It was the old LaPorte Courthouse in Wayne County that was built in 1874, but became the Poor Farm sometime after 1882. So that's why it doesn't really look like a poor farm. There was a fire in 1884 that destroyed a lot of it, but it was still used in 1915. So whatever damage occurred, they were able to repair it. The cupola was dismantled from the house or courthouse, however you want, poor farm or courthouse, in 1922. And then the cupola was moved, and that's all that remained then after that. Here is the Webster County Poor Farm. The house is the top left photo there. The county purchased the land in 1878 with 320 acres, and then they rented the land in the 1880s. It's a white two-story frame house built by Palmer and Brown in 1897, but David Dessler was the architect. So here's an instance where I know the architect for the house and the people who built it. The manager lived in the front, and the poor people lived in the back. This was a 17-room house. There were several additions to the house, once in 1907 that added 2 bedrooms and a dining room to the ground floor. I know there are a couple other additions, I'm just not exactly sure when or what happened. In 1955, the county sold the farm to build a county house, or a county hospital, and the house was torn down. And a later owner moved the last of the buildings. And I included the picture on the lower right. It wasn't really part of the Poor Farm, but this was a school right across the road from the Poor Farm, and it was the District 23 school in Webster County, but it was known as the Poor Farm School. So there were children that lived in this home that would have attended that school there. So that is the end of the slides that I have. Pictures of at least, the home or part of the farmstead. I don't know how much time we have left, but I can start, talk about some of the other, poor farms in the county until we run out of time, but I'm just not going to have any fun pictures to show you or anything. The Boone County poor farm isn't standing anymore. It was purchased in 1921, so later than the other poor farms with 160 acres, and it possibly existed until 1947. I don't have a lot of information about this poor farm, but that's a little bit that I do have. Butte County, again, I know there is a poor farm there, but there's nothing that's left there. And this is another county where I'm having some trouble figuring out the exact timeline for. In 1919, I'm finding references that suggested the county sell the current poor farm and begin a 40-acre one closer to Alliance, so a little bit closer to town. In 1920, Alliance, the city of Alliance, and the county traded for the farm. And then in 1921, there's a 320-acre poor farm with a 9-room brick building. Buffalo County has, again, a farm that no standing house. It began in 1889 with 160 acres. And W.T. Scott was the contractor for the 2-story house that was there. 80 acres were added on to this 160-acre poor farm, so for a total of 240 acres. And this one also had a cemetery by 1921. In 1914, the house needed repairs, so the county just suggested tearing down the building to build a smaller house. The farm closed completely about 1920, and the county rented the land. And the county then finally sold the farm in 1959 to finance the building of the county jail. The Burt County farm started in 1873 with 160 acres, and a month later added another 40 acres to total 200. There was a 2-story frame house, and the manager and family lived in the north part of the house. The county sold the farm in 1957, and then the poor farm closed. The house burned down in the 1970s sometime, and myself and another colleague in a project we were working on were able to visit this farm. Some of the outbuildings are still there, but the house that's there is a new house. And this one was right next to a CCC camp, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. And some of those kind of foundations are there and just right next to the poor farm. The Butler County poor farm had 160 acres and was a large 2-story house. And it was used from the late 1800s to about 1930. The county sold the farm in 1948, and the house was torn down. In Cedar County, they had a 160-acre farm. The house was built about 1900 and had a 1-story house with wood siding. The Chase County farm may have began in 1940, and I say may because I haven't found any definitive research saying it was then. And they, instead of having traditional houses, no matter the size or shape or number of stories, had 2 boxcars that they used for their poor people, with a 2-room house and a 5-room house. And this is the only instance of boxcars using to house people that I've found for poor farms in Nebraska. And the county sold the farm in 1944. As I said at the beginning, Cheyenne County had a poor farm, but it never had buildings on it. And it was 230 acres in 1893, but decreased to 80 acres by 1916. And I don't exactly know when the county sold the farmland, but it was probably sometime after World War II. The Colfax County poor farm had 160 acres. The county purchased it in 1895, and the farm was really started in 1905, so 10 years after they bought it. There were 2 houses. The first one was built in 1898 and had 12 rooms, and the second house was smaller and had 5 rooms. This one operated until 1934, and I do know there are burials on the farm. Whether or not they've been moved to a nearby cemetery, I don't know. And then Sometimes counties would have, like I said at the beginning, a separate cemetery. Sometimes they would have a pauper's area in a nearby cemetery. And sometimes they would bury people who died while living at the poor farm, just on the farm somewhere. There'd be a little area. Cumming County had 160 acres. It probably existed from 1900 to 1918 for sure. But the house was built in 1879 by Edmund Krause. I don't know if when he built the house, it was part of the poor farm or not. I just know it existed for those 18 years. I just don't know if it existed earlier or later than that. Dakota County had an 80-acre poor farm. It was known as the Berger Poor Farm because Mr. Berger gave the county money to purchase the land in 1890. And T.F. McGee built the house in 1892. Dawson County had a 160-acre poor farm that they purchased in 1888 and sold in 1914. There were 4 bedrooms in the house, and then 1 in the summer kitchen. This house also had a separate summer kitchen, and there were also 2 bedrooms in the granary building. Dixon County had a 160-acre poor farm. There was a 2-story house that was built in 1894. This house had 18 rooms. It closed in 1942, and the county rented the land for 6 years until they sold the land in 1948. After the county sold this farm, the later owners remodeled and remodeled the house and the top floor, and then they decided to just remove the top floor and 1 room. I don't know why, but they did. The Dodge County poor farm started with 160 acres and then later grew to 240. The house was built in the 1880s, but the poor farm items were sold in 1940. The county still maintained ownership of the land of the buildings, but the farm animals and the implements were sold then. But then they sold the house and farm in 1955, and the house was torn down in the 1970s. The Douglas County poor farm has an interesting history. The first one was built in 1859 with 170 acres. In 1887, E.E. Myers drew plans for his 2-story brick house, and Ryan and Walsh began constructing the building. The land that the poor farm was on was also used for a county hospital, and then one part of the poor farm was parceled off and sold to different individuals, and there were lawsuits involved, making it to the Supreme Court about the legality of selling part of this poor farm to individuals. And the land later was used for outdoor recreation, and it's currently a golf course in town. The county decided that they wanted to have their poor farm farther out of town because as Omaha was growing, it was starting to encroach on the poor farm. Some of the people thought it maybe wasn't a good idea to have poor people next to people who lived in town. So they moved it farther west. Interestingly, that poor farm is now in the city limits of Omaha also. But that house was designed by John Latenzer and Sons, and Latenzer is a well-known architect in Nebraska. And it was built in 1930 by Ruther and Farrell. It's no longer there. It did become a veteran's home. The building isn't there anymore, but the barn is. And both of these poor farms had construction issues with poor quality materials, poor building methods. The first poor farm really had some significant problems. During the construction, an entire wing collapsed while people were in the building, kind of going through and touring. And then that was the south wing, and then the north wing collapsed in 1892. So that first farm just had problems right from the start. Franklin County had a poor farm, and I don't know right now if the buildings are still standing or not. I'm not exactly sure of the location. I found references to 3 different locations, so I'm not sure which is correct. I doubt it was located in all 3 parts. But I'm thinking it did have 320 acres, and if this is the farm that I think it is, it's just east of Hildreth. But there are also a couple of references saying it was just south of town, so I don't know exactly where it was, but I do know they had one. Gosper County had a 320-acre poor farm and was in operation in 1940, but again, this is another county that I just haven't been able to dig up any more information yet. Greeley County, again, I'm not exactly sure where it was. I know they had one, though. And in 1878, there was a section of land for the county farm that was deeded to the county by the Burlington and Missouri Railroad. And in 1914, the poor farm was no longer used by the county as a poor farm, but they rented the land. The Howard County poor farm is 160 acres and existed at least from 1912 through 1921, but I don't know if it existed before or after that. The Jefferson County poor farm was 320 acres. The first house was built in 1892, and it was a 2-story house with an addition to it. And existed from at least 1889 through 1921. Next, here's the Lincoln County poor farm, a little bit of information I have for you today. It was 160 acres, and in 1894, there was a poor farm in existence with a frame house. There were several other kind of farms, I'll say in quotes because it sort of moved around a little bit over the years. And in 1923, there was a private individual who established the Lincoln County Poor Farm under contract with the county. And there have been a lot of things like this book that was mentioned earlier about this farm. The person who owned the farm then was not the nicest of individuals, abused the people at the poor farm, and the conditions were not very good. From most of the references that I've seen for different poor farms around the county, a lot of the managers really cared about the people who lived there. And I had a sense that you really had to kind of love what you were doing. You weren't making much money. Sure, you had a place to live as the manager and as the family, but the conditions in the house weren't always the greatest. So they really had to make do with just a small amount of resources. But in Lincoln County, it seems like the lady who managed it for quite a while kind of took advantage of her position, of family members and people at the farm. And Merrick County, there was a 200-acre poor farm in 1899, but had decreased to 160 acres in 1917. And I don't know anything about the buildings on the farm, what they looked like or how many there were. The Nemaha County Poor Farm had 160 acres. It was started in 1872, and Boosfield and Gates built a large brick building, and George Armstrong made the brick. And I think that's nice that we know who made the brick to build this house, not just the people who built the house. Otoe County had a 160-acre poor farm. Their 3-story brick house was built in 1886 by John Dunbar. And today we would call the house a split-level house, so it had 3 levels to it, but it wasn't what we would today think of as a 3-story house. In 1936, voters chose not to sell the farm, which I thought was interesting. Most of the time votes would come up, and it might take 1 vote before the voters would approve the sale of the farm. But when a lot of counties were deciding to sell their farms, this county wanted to keep theirs open. But then I don't have any more references to when the county did decide to just close the poor farm. And it's also interesting, I've seen references to a 9-room house and a 20-room house. So I'm sure it was somewhere in the middle there. I just don't exactly know how many rooms it had. The Perkins County farm had 160 acres of unimproved land. So they had a quarter section of land that was just used as a farm, but there weren't ever any buildings and no one ever lived there. And it looks like we are out of time. So if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer. Yes?
What's the title of the book about Lincoln County?
The title of the Lincoln County book. Do you happen to know that? I don't have it off the top of my
I
head.
believe it's Evil Obsession.
I think so. The Annie Cook story, I think, yeah. Yep. Yes.
In American society today, there's kind of a tension in our discussion about poor people. On the one hand, Christian compassion type of ideas. On the other hand, kind of root hog or die.
Right.
And I wondered if in your reading you saw that tension going back in Nebraska 100 years or 150 years. Kind of the same circles. Do they go back through the same circles there?
This person was wondering if I saw any tensions with poor people back in the day that we can see sometime in today's society. My research right now has really sort of concentrated on the farmsteads, but of course I do see information about the poor people. And there was a stigma, even for the poor people living there. If they didn't have to live there, they wouldn't. You know, a lot of times, a lot of counties would have sort of a come and go policy that if they needed to stay there, they could, and they were able to leave at any time. They didn't have to get permission from the manager or one of the county commissioners or anything. But most people stayed for just a short time. A lot of them were very bored living there. You know, like I said, they had the option of working at the farm, but you know, if you weren't able to work there, there wasn't a lot to do, especially in houses that didn't have any electricity. You know, once it was dark, you may not be able to see a lot in the house. Some counties didn't allow lamps in the bedrooms because they were afraid of it being a fire hazard. So the lamps may have been allowed in the living room maybe and the kitchen only, but not in spaces that you would have used in other parts of the house. So there was definitely a stigma, and if you could get out, you could, and you didn't want to stay very long.
And who were they, just real quickly? I'm just fascinated. Were they old people? Were they mentally ill? Were they single parents who'd been abused?
Yep,
Were they
he was
alcoholic?
asking who they were, and I will say yes to all of that. There were men, women, children, elderly people, you know, there were a few, you know, blind people, you know, people that were maybe missing a limb. There were, as I said, insane before, that maybe the county thought they had some sort of mental problem and decided to put them in the county poor farm. They weren't maybe mentally ill enough to really require specialized institutional care as time went on, but you know, maybe it was a housewife who just, you know, needed a break and they thought she was crazy, so they stuck her in the poor farm for a while. There were a couple of references to something like that, so, yes.
I was kind of wondering, if you have elderly and sick people, who is providing the medical assistance or the nursing care?
Yep.
I mean, they need help getting up to go anywhere or get to a meal.
Yep.
or any of that
Yep,
stuff.
she asked about medical care. A lot of counties did contract with a doctor in the county to provide medical care to the people, and that wasn't very long. I mean, they were there maybe once a week, once a month. It wasn't very often, and would just do a very kind of quick visit with maybe some medication. He didn't get paid much, but a lot of times it was the farm manager and his wife that really
Did the
kind of,
day-to-day.
yes, did the day-to-day care for them. And it looks like we are out of time. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk, you know, afterwards later, and I would be. But thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful crowd.